Chosen, one heaven has aligned this moment with precision, and you did not arrive here by accident. The Spirit has drawn you because you are standing at the edge of a supernatural breakthrough, a divine wealth transfer already moving in your direction. What you are about to hear is not information, but activation. The Most High is stirring the atmosphere around your life, whispering, "Prepare to receive." Like Psalm 23 declares, your cup is meant to overflow. Chosen one, open your spirit now. What God is releasing in this hour carries the power to shift your entire future. Human beings often encounter periods in life when events appear disconnected, confusing, or misaligned with their expectations. These phases can feel disorienting because the mind naturally seeks coherent structure and predictability. When outcomes do not match internal effort, a person may begin questioning their abilities or the meaning behind their struggles. Yet psychological research shows that such periods of uncertainty frequently precede moments of reorganization and growth. What feels like stagnation is often a transition state in which old patterns are dissolving and new patterns have not yet fully emerged. Many individuals who demonstrate high resilience share similar experiences. They continue moving forward despite limited external validation, and they maintain responsibility even during private emotional difficulty. Their internal perseverance, though unseen, forms the foundation of later breakthroughs. Observers may notice only the visible behaviors, but the more significant battles happen internally in moments of quiet decision-making and emotional endurance. These private efforts shape cognitive frameworks that later support clearer decisions and greater stability. When people believe they must constantly fight or strive to secure progress, they risk overlooking the importance of cognitive rest. Excessive striving activates chronic stress responses, narrowing perception and limiting problem-solving ability. In contrast, moments of intentional rest allow the nervous system to recalibrate, enabling more effective processing of information and increasing mental clarity. Rest, therefore, is not passive. It is a necessary component of cognitive and emotional regulation. There are times when individuals interpret obstacles as personal failure, when in reality, those obstacles serve as a form of environmental feedback. They indicate that certain paths, methods, or identities are no longer aligned with one's longer-term trajectory. Much like how biological systems adapt when conditions shift, human lives reorganize themselves under pressure. The restructuring that takes place during these periods can feel destabilizing, yet it is essential for future growth. Seen through this lens, challenges are not indicators of inadequacy, but catalysts for refinement. Psychology also suggests that individuals often internalize scarcity-based thinking when outcomes are delayed. They assume they must work harder, push more, or control every variable. But many forms of progress do not emerge through force. They develop through alignment between intention, timing, and sustainable action. When a person transitions from survival-driven behavior into a state of receptivity, they become more attuned to opportunities that were previously obscured by stress or over-effort. This shift often results in breakthroughs that appear sudden, but are actually the cumulative effect of long-standing internal preparation. Personal testimonies across disciplines from leadership to psychology to spiritual study show that moments of collapse often precede significant transformation. When existing structures in a person's life no longer support their emerging identity or goals, those structures naturally fall away. This can include relationships, routines, beliefs, or career paths. Though the process appears destructive, its function is constructive. It creates space for systems better suited to the individual's development. Recognition of this pattern enables a person to view disruptions with greater objectivity and less fear. The transition into a more stable and expansive phase of life requires a different mental posture than the one used to survive difficult seasons. It calls for openness, cognitive flexibility, and the willingness to allow new forms of support opportunity and guidance. These qualities are often counterintuitive for individuals accustomed to relying exclusively on their effort. Yet research shows that adaptability and receptivity correlate strongly with long-term success, especially in environments that are unpredictable or rapidly changing. There is also a philosophical dimension to this shift. Many traditions suggest that life contains rhythms, seasons of activity, and seasons of integration. When a person acknowledges these rhythms instead of resisting them, they gain the capacity to move through transitions more effectively. They begin to understand that not every advancement must be earned through strain. Some advancements arise naturally when internal alignment meets external timing. In this context, stepping into a new phase of clarity, stability, or opportunity is not a reward for endurance, but a natural progression of psychological and situational evolution. It is the outcome of resilience, introspection, and accumulated insight. What may feel like a sudden breakthrough is often the visible result of hidden cognitive restructuring that took place over months or years. Part of embracing this transition is recognizing that life is no longer demanding survival-based responses. Instead, it is inviting a shift toward receiving, integrating, and acting with greater strategic calm. Progress from this point forward is not driven by force, but by clarity. It is not fueled by urgency, but by coherence. This marks the beginning of a more grounded and sustainable chapter. One in which the individual does not merely endure circumstances, but participates in shaping them with greater awareness and balance. Periods of personal transformation often include a subtle internal shift that people only recognize in hindsight. What initially appears as uncertainty or stagnation is frequently the mind reorganizing itself for a higher level of functioning. When individuals transition from a prolonged state of effort into a more receptive mental posture, they gradually notice a change in how they interpret challenges and opportunities. This shift reflects cognitive maturation rather than external luck. A useful parallel can be drawn from cognitive psychology. When the brain is overwhelmed, it defaults to familiar patterns because they require less processing energy. However, once mental load decreases, the brain becomes capable of noticing new information, making broader associations, and identifying possibilities that previously seemed invisible. In practical terms, when a person stops approaching life from a state of urgency, they open space for more nuanced and adaptive decisions. This transition is not passive, it is a recalibration of perception. Many individuals who have experienced prolonged stress find it difficult to transition into a phase where life requires less struggle. They may interpret ease as unfamiliar or even unsafe because their identity has been shaped around overcoming difficulty. This reaction is normal. Behavioral conditioning teaches the mind to anticipate threats even when circumstances improve. Learning to trust stability requires patience, self-observation, and the willingness to adopt a new internal narrative about what progress looks like. Financial, emotional, or relational breakthroughs often follow this shift in internal orientation. When a person stops operating from fear or scarcity, their actions become more intentional and less reactive. They focus less on controlling outcomes and more on making decisions aligned with long-term values. Research in behavioral economics supports this idea. Individuals who operate from a mindset of abundance tend to make more strategic choices and demonstrate greater resilience when unexpected challenges arise. Their stability comes not from external guarantees, but from internal clarity. Personal experience often reinforces this principle. Many people recall moments when they stopped trying to force solutions and instead allowed space for alternatives to emerge. The resolution that followed was not a product of inactivity, but of improved alignment between intention and timing. This is similar to how complex systems in nature reorganize. When pressure is removed, the system naturally settles into a more coherent structure. Human lives are no different. Clarity often emerges once unnecessary tension is released. It is important to recognize that breakthroughs are not always dramatic. Sometimes they begin with subtle shifts, an unexpected opportunity. A conversation that reorients one's perspective, a renewed sense of confidence, or a moment of insight that reframes an old problem. These signals indicate that internal and external conditions are synchronizing. What felt impossible previously becomes obtainable because the individual is operating from a more regulated and receptive state. Scientific studies on resilience and post-traumatic growth suggest that individuals who integrate past difficulties into a broader narrative of meaning tend to adapt more quickly to new opportunities. They view their challenges not as personal failures, but as formative experiences that contributed to their current capacity. This mindset reduces resistance to change and increases openness to positive developments. In many cases, this openness becomes the catalyst for accelerated personal or professional advancement. There is also a philosophical dimension to this process. Human development does not follow a straight line. It unfolds in cycles of contraction and expansion. Periods of contraction create pressure for internal reorganization, while periods of expansion allow the individual to utilize the capabilities that were cultivated during struggle. Understanding this rhythm reduces self-blame and encourages a more balanced approach to progress. As the individual begins to integrate these insights, they often discover a new sense of stability. They no longer pursue goals from desperation, but from clarity. They no longer interpret delays as personal judgment, but as part of a broader developmental timeline. This shift in interpretation is transformative. It marks the point where progress becomes more fluid, opportunities align more naturally, and decisions feel less burdensome. The foundation of this transition is the recognition that certain outcomes are not achieved by force, but by readiness. When the internal state is aligned with the external environment, movement becomes smoother and more sustainable. Breakthroughs then appear not as sudden miracles, but as the natural expression of a mind and life that have reached coherence. This phase signals the beginning of a more intentional and balanced trajectory, one where progress is supported by insight rather than strain, and where the individual begins to participate in their life with a renewed sense of calm and direction. A significant aspect of personal evolution involves learning to reinterpret one's environment not as a series of random events, but as a system of interconnected processes. When individuals begin to understand that their lives are shaped by both internal states and external conditions, they gain a more realistic sense of agency. They recognize that progress is not solely determined by effort, but by the alignment between preparation, opportunity, and timing. One of the most overlooked dimensions of growth is the gradual development of discernment. Discernment is not a mystical trait. It is a cognitive skill shaped by accumulated experience and reflection. It allows individuals to sense when something is right for them or when a path is misaligned, even if they cannot immediately articulate why. This ability becomes increasingly sharp when the mind is no longer preoccupied with survival-based thinking. As stress decreases, cognitive resources become available for higher-level processing, enabling more accurate evaluations of complex situations. Patterns that were previously overlooked begin to stand out with new clarity. Decisions that once felt overwhelming become more manageable because the individual is no longer reacting from fear, but responding from understanding. This shift also affects interpersonal relationships. People who once seemed essential to one's life may gradually drift to the periphery while new connections emerge that are more aligned with one's evolving values. These movements may appear coincidental, but they often reflect deeper changes in identity and priorities. Psychologists frequently note that individuals navigating a developmental transition tend to experience a sense of inner dissonance. This occurs because the mind is trying to release outdated beliefs while simultaneously integrating new ones. The discomfort is not evidence of regression. It is part of the brain's process of reorganizing its internal map of the world. Many describe this as a period of mental fog or uncertainty, but it is actually a stage of cognitive restructuring, similar to how muscle fibers rebuild after exertion. During this phase, certain internal narratives may resurface questions about worthiness, capability, or direction. These narratives are not signs of failure, but echoes of past conditioning. Recognizing them without internalizing them is a critical step in the maturation process. When individuals learn to observe their thoughts rather than be governed by them, they gain psychological distance, which supports healthier decision-making. Breakthroughs often occur shortly after this cognitive turbulence settles. The individual begins to perceive their circumstances with fresh clarity. What once seemed like insurmountable obstacles now appear solvable. Previously unseen opportunities become visible. This is not due to sudden external change, but due to an internal shift that allows the mind to detect information it previously filtered out under stress. In this way, cognitive openness becomes a precursor to practical progress. There is also a measurable shift in emotional regulation. When someone no longer interprets challenges as threats to their identity, they experience fewer physiological stress responses. As the body's stress chemistry decreases, the mind becomes more capable of sustained focus, innovative thinking, and long-term planning. These biological factors play a direct role in one's ability to recognize and pursue opportunities effectively. At this point in the developmental cycle, many individuals encounter what could be described as compound progress. Instead of a single breakthrough, multiple aspects of life begin to improve simultaneously. Finances stabilize, relationships become healthier, self-esteem increases, and strategic opportunities arise. This clustering effect occurs because systems within a person's life are interconnected. When one part stabilizes, it influences others through positive feedback loops. Personal testimonies often reflect this pattern. Individuals describe long seasons where nothing seemed to progress, followed by sudden periods where multiple advancements occurred in quick succession. Viewed through a scientific lens, this is consistent with the principle of threshold change. Systems accumulate internal pressure and reorganize abruptly once a critical threshold is crossed. The transformation seems instantaneous, but it is actually the culmination of incremental internal adjustments. The transition into this new stage, however, requires a degree of trust, not necessarily in a spiritual sense, but trust in the process of development itself. People must be willing to release the strategies that sustain them during hardship and adopt behaviors that align with stability and growth. If someone continues operating from a mindset shaped by scarcity fear or hypervigilance, they may unintentionally limit their progress even when conditions have improved. A practical example can be seen in financial behavior. Individuals emerging from prolonged financial instability often continue to make decisions based on fear of loss rather than long-term growth. They may avoid opportunities, remain in limiting environments, or overlook paths that could lead to greater stability. But as their internal sense of security strengthens, their decision-making becomes more balanced, increasing the likelihood of sustained improvement. Ultimately, this stage represents the beginning of an integrative life phase, one in which accumulated learning, restored clarity, and improved emotional regulation converge. The individual steps into a more grounded pattern of living, no longer driven solely by necessity, but by intention. Progress becomes less erratic and more consistent. Opportunities feel less accidental and more aligned with one's strengths and values. This does not signal the end of challenges, but reflects a new capacity to navigate them without being destabilized. The individual develops a stronger sense of coherence, which psychologists define as the feeling that life is meaningful, manageable, and comprehensible. This coherence forms the foundation for long-term growth. Another factor that shapes this stage of development is the gradual emergence of internal stability. When a person begins to understand their own patterns, motivations, and limitations more clearly, they gain a kind of psychological footing that makes external circumstances feel less chaotic. Stability is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of a reliable internal framework that guides interpretation and response. Individuals who reach this point often report feeling more grounded, even if their external environment has not yet fully changed. This sense of grounding often leads to clearer decision-making. People become less reactive and more deliberate. They no longer pursue goals out of fear of missing out or fear of falling behind. Instead, they evaluate options based on long-term coherence, personal values, and realistic assessment of outcomes. This shift reflects the transition from impulsive behavior to reflective judgment, a pattern commonly associated with higher emotional intelligence and cognitive maturity. At this point, social dynamics also tend to reorganize. Relationships that once held significant influence may lose their emotional intensity as the individual develops stronger boundaries and a clearer sense of identity. Conversely, new relationships often emerge that support growth, stability, and intellectual alignment. Research on social development shows that as individuals refine their inner frameworks, their external connections naturally adjust to reflect these internal changes. This does not happen by force. Rather, it occurs through natural shifts in resonance and compatibility. A particularly important element of this period is the role of self-perception. Psychological studies indicate that individuals who hold more balanced, evidence-based views of themselves navigate life transitions with greater ease. When someone no longer defines themselves solely by past failures or conditional self-worth, they reduce internal resistance to progress. They begin to view themselves as agents capable of adaptation rather than as victims of circumstance. This shift in self-concept expands the range of options they are willing to consider. Environmental factors also play a meaningful role. As individuals develop clearer priorities, they often modify their physical or digital environments to support their emerging goals. This may include changes in routines, workspaces, or information consumption. Environmental restructuring enhances cognitive efficiency by reducing distractions and aligning external conditions with internal intentions. Over time, this improves both productivity and emotional balance. Another phenomenon frequently observed during this stage is the emergence of what researchers describe as latent potential. These are skills, insights, or strengths that existed but were previously suppressed by stress, fear, or lack of opportunity. When the mind reaches a more regulated state, these capacities begin to surface naturally. People often describe this as suddenly realizing they are more capable than they previously believed. This experience is not sudden growth. It is the activation of previously inaccessible abilities. Progress may accelerate significantly during this phase. Because the individual is no longer internally fragmented or operating under conflicting motivations, their efforts become more efficient. They can invest energy into fewer, more aligned goals, producing measurable results. This pattern matches the principle of focused attention. Concentrated effort yields disproportionately higher returns compared to scattered effort. The individual also becomes more comfortable with uncertainty. They understand that not every question requires immediate answers, and not every challenge requires immediate resolution. This tolerance for ambiguity is a hallmark of advanced psychological development. It reduces anxiety and enables more creative problem-solving. Rather than forcing outcomes prematurely, individuals begin to observe, evaluate, and respond with greater patience. As they step into this new orientation, their relationship with time changes. Instead of viewing time as an enemy or a scarce resource, they begin to see it as a medium through which growth occurs. This reduces emotional urgency and increases strategic thinking. They become more willing to invest in long-term processes instead of seeking short-term relief. In many ways, this stage marks the transition from reactive living to intentional living. The individual is not simply responding to circumstances, but shaping them with deliberate choices. They cultivate routines that support mental clarity, relationships that reinforce stability, and attitudes that enable growth. Progress becomes more sustainable because it is based on understanding rather than impulse. From this viewpoint, breakthroughs are not isolated events, but the result of accumulated clarity, persistent effort, and improved internal organization. They are the natural outcome of a system that has reached a new level of coherence. The person begins to experience life not as something happening to them, but as something they participate in consciously. This coherent state lays the groundwork for the next phase of development, where growth becomes not only possible, but increasingly predictable and self-reinforcing. An important dimension of this developmental stage involves the refinement of one's internal narrative. People often underestimate how significantly their self-talk influences perception, motivation, and resilience. When an individual begins to adopt a more rational and balanced internal dialogue, they unconsciously reshape their relationship with challenges. Difficulties that once appeared threatening are now interpreted as manageable problems, and setbacks are understood as temporary fluctuations rather than definitive failures. This cognitive reframing allows the mind to operate with greater clarity and adaptability. As internal narratives shift, individuals also develop more accurate assessments of their own capabilities. Instead of viewing themselves through the lens of past hardships or perceived inadequacies, they begin to evaluate themselves based on present evidence and observable progress. Research in personality psychology shows that the ability to update one's self-concept in response to new information is strongly correlated with long-term well-being. People who adjust their views of themselves as they grow are more likely to pursue challenging goals, maintain optimism, and recover quickly from disruptions. This internal restructuring often produces a sense of renewed momentum. Individuals notice that decisions feel less burdensome, choices become clearer, and problems that once consumed emotional energy now appear more straightforward. This is not the result of sudden external improvement, but of enhanced cognitive organization. The mind becomes better at sorting information, identifying priorities, and filtering out unnecessary noise. As a result, decision fatigue decreases and confidence increases. Another meaningful development at this stage is the strengthened ability to evaluate intentions, both one's own and others. With reduced emotional turbulence, people become more skilled at understanding why they feel drawn to certain decisions or relationships and why they feel resistant to others. They recognize the difference between genuine intuition and fear-based avoidance. This improved self-awareness makes them less vulnerable to external pressure or manipulation, as their choices are anchored in a clearer understanding of personal values. Social interactions also take on a different tone. Individuals become more discerning about the environments and relationships they allow into their lives. They gravitate toward people who support stability, growth, and mutual respect. Simultaneously, they distance themselves from interactions that reinforce negative cycles or compromise their well-being. This is not a withdrawal from others, but a recalibration of social boundaries. Studies show that people with healthier interpersonal boundaries experience lower stress levels and stronger emotional regulation. As this internal and external alignment grows, new opportunities tend to emerge with greater frequency. These opportunities may appear as career advancements, improved financial stability, or intellectual and creative breakthroughs. Their appearance is not accidental. They arise because the individual is now operating from a more coherent and receptive state. When the mind is less consumed by past anxieties or survival-oriented thinking, it becomes more attuned to recognizing and pursuing beneficial possibilities. One particularly interesting phenomenon is the reactivation of previously dormant ambitions. Goals that once felt unrealistic may now feel attainable because internal resistance has diminished. This reactivation often surprises individuals. They discover interests or aspirations from earlier stages of life resurfacing with new relevance. Developmental psychologists note that these resurfacing goals often represent authentic aspects of identity that were suppressed during stressful periods. Once stability returns, these dormant elements re-emerge to guide the next phase of growth. At this point, individuals also experience a shift in how they measure progress. Instead of relying solely on external benchmarks, they begin to track internal indicators such as mental clarity, emotional balance, and alignment with personal values. These metrics provide a more accurate and sustainable gauge of development. The individual becomes less concerned with immediate results and more focused on consistent, grounded improvement. This change in orientation fosters a sense of long-term trust in the direction of one's life. The individual recognizes that growth does not need to be forced. It unfolds naturally when internal conditions are stable and aligned. This perspective reduces the tendency to react impulsively or to seek drastic changes out of frustration. Instead, the person adopts a measured, strategic approach that results in more reliable outcomes. In summary, this stage represents a deeper integration of self-awareness, stability, and intentional action. The individual shifts from reacting to circumstances to actively shaping them with clarity and purpose. Their internal system becomes increasingly coherent, allowing for more efficient thinking, better decision-making, and sustained emotional regulation. This consolidation of internal and external alignment sets the foundation for the next phase, where growth becomes increasingly deliberate and self-reinforcing. As individuals continue progressing through this developmental trajectory, they often encounter a heightened sense of personal agency. This agency is not characterized by impulsive assertiveness, but by a calm recognition that their choices exert a meaningful influence on outcomes. It is a shift from feeling acted upon by circumstances to perceiving themselves as active participants in shaping their environment. Psychological research on locus of control indicates that individuals who internalize responsibility for their trajectory tend to show greater resilience, adaptability, and long-term satisfaction. This transition signals that the individual is beginning to rely less on external validation and more on internal metrics of progress. Alongside this growing sense of agency, the individual develops a deeper tolerance for uncertainty. Instead of interpreting ambiguity as threatening, they begin to regard it as a natural feature of complex systems, including their own lives. This tolerance arises from cognitive maturation, the ability to hold multiple possibilities in mind without becoming overwhelmed by them. People often misunderstand clarity as the absence of uncertainty, but true clarity emerges from learning how to navigate uncertainty without losing internal equilibrium. The ability to remain stable in transitional phases is a strong predictor of psychological flexibility. Another refinement that becomes apparent in this stage is the increased differentiation between intuition and impulse. Early in development, these two sensations may feel indistinguishable, as both can appear spontaneously and with emotional force. However, with growing introspective skill, individuals learn to recognize subtle distinctions. Impulses tend to be immediate, emotionally charged and short-lived, often emerging from habitual patterns or unprocessed experiences. Intuition is quieter, more consistent, and typically accompanied by a sense of groundedness. Neuroscientific studies suggest that intuitive insights emerge from integrated neural networks that draw on both emotion and stored knowledge, making them more reliable when properly recognized. This differentiation enhances decision-making significantly. Individuals begin to choose actions that reflect their deeper values rather than reacting out of temporary emotion. They also become more aware of the long-term consequences of their choices. This does not mean they strive for perfection. Rather, they develop a more realistic appreciation for the iterative nature of growth. Mistakes are reframed as data points rather than failures, which facilitates continuous improvement. As internal clarity strengthens, individuals often notice a reduction in cognitive noise. The mind becomes less occupied by hypothetical scenarios, worries about potential judgment, or attempts to predict every possible outcome. The decrease in mental clutter creates more bandwidth for creativity, analytical thinking, and strategic planning. In this state, ideas are not forced. They arise naturally because the cognitive system is functioning with greater coherence. This condition resembles what positive psychology refers to as flow readiness, in which the mind is primed for sustained focus and productive engagement. This stage also brings a nuanced re-evaluation of personal boundaries. Individuals become more aware of their emotional bandwidth and are less inclined to overextend themselves for the sake of approval or obligation. They begin to recognize that sustainable generosity must be rooted in stability rather than self-sacrifice. Social scientists have observed that individuals who maintain healthy boundaries exhibit higher levels of emotional resilience and lower levels of stress-related symptoms. These boundaries are not rigid barriers, but adaptive filters that protect energy and promote more intentional forms of connection. Interpersonal relationships begin to reflect this shift. The individual gravitates toward interactions that offer reciprocity, intellectual stimulation, or emotional grounding. They become less tolerant of dynamics built on dependency, confusion, or manipulation. This reorganization of relationships is not driven by resentment, but by clarity. With a more solid internal foundation, the person is capable of forming connections that reinforce growth rather than impede it. These relational shifts often bring a sense of calm because the individual is no longer entangled in cycles that drain their emotional resources. Concurrently, there is a gradual realignment of daily habits and routines. The individual becomes more attentive to patterns that support cognitive stability, adequate rest, structured environments, intentional time allocation, and reduced exposure to overstimulating inputs. These adjustments do not appear dramatic from the outside, but have significant cumulative effects. Neuroscience emphasizes that sustainable change is often the result of small, consistent actions that shape neural pathways over time. When individuals refine their routines with this awareness, they create conditions that naturally reinforce long-term growth. A notable internal development in this stage is the quiet emergence of self-trust. Instead of constantly seeking external reassurance, the individual begins to rely more on their own reasoning, experience, and observations. This trust does not manifest as arrogance. Rather, it appears as a calm confidence that decisions can be made thoughtfully and adjusted when necessary. This self-trust becomes a stabilizing force, especially during periods of transition or uncertainty, providing an anchor in moments where external clarity is limited. Overall, this stage represents a deepening coherence between thought, emotion, and behavior. The individual operates less from reactive states and more from integrated awareness. Their internal processes support forward movement without unnecessary friction, and their external environment gradually reorganizes to reflect this internal shift. This alignment prepares them for the next phase of development, in which capacity, creativity, and strategic influence expand in more complex and deliberate ways. As development advances into the next phase, individuals begin to experience a more refined sense of alignment between their internal intentions and their external actions. What previously required deliberate effort now occurs with increasing fluidity. This is largely because cognitive dissonance diminishes as one's behaviors become more congruent with personal values. Psychological literature suggests that when individuals reduce the gap between what they believe and what they practice, their mental energy becomes more efficiently allocated and their overall well-being improves. This alignment creates an expanded capacity for strategic foresight. Instead of reacting to circumstances as they arise, individuals are able to anticipate outcomes more accurately and plan accordingly. This phenomenon is not mystical, it is the natural result of improved pattern recognition. The brain, having accumulated sufficient experiential data, begins to detect trends that were previously overlooked. Individuals may describe this as seeing things coming, but in scientific terms, it reflects enhanced predictive processing. This capacity allows for more thoughtful pacing, fewer impulsive decisions, and a greater sense of control over long-term trajectories. Additionally, there is a noticeable refinement in emotional regulation, whereas earlier stages may have involved frequent emotional fluctuations or difficulty interpreting internal cues. This phase is characterized by smoother transitions between emotional states. Emotional regulation is not about suppression, rather, it involves an increased ability to modulate responses without becoming overwhelmed. Studies in affective neuroscience indicate that individuals who achieve this level of regulation tend to show greater resilience, more stable interpersonal relationships, and improved decision-making capacities. A corresponding development is the ability to distinguish between transient emotions and meaningful signals. Not every discomfort indicates a problem, just as not every surge of excitement indicates alignment. By developing a more discerning internal filter, individuals become capable of interpreting their emotional landscape with greater accuracy. This discernment reduces misinterpretation and prevents unnecessary detours. It also sharpens intuition, which now functions as a refined cognitive tool grounded in both emotional awareness and accumulated insight. As clarity continues to increase, individuals begin to confront long-standing assumptions about identity, capability, and purpose. These assumptions may have been formed in earlier stages through social conditioning, limited exposure, or past challenges. Revisiting them is not easy, but this phase brings enough cognitive and emotional stability to evaluate them with honesty. Such evaluations often lead to significant internal restructuring. Individuals may realize that certain limitations they once accepted were not factual constraints, but inherited beliefs. The dissolution of these beliefs often produces a sense of psychological expansion, which researchers sometimes describe as a recalibration of self-efficacy. This expansion naturally influences goal formation. Goals are no longer generated from external pressure, comparison, or fear of inadequacy. Instead, they emerge from a clearer understanding of personal values and realistic capabilities. These goals tend to be both ambitious and grounded, reflecting a balance between ideal vision and pragmatic execution. Research on self-determination theory underscores that goals aligned with intrinsic values yield greater motivation, satisfaction, and sustained engagement. This intrinsic orientation fuels consistent progress without the burnout commonly associated with externally driven aspirations. With this shift in goal formation comes a heightened appreciation for deliberate pacing. The individual recognizes that speed does not equate to effectiveness, and that sustainable outcomes require measured, consistent effort. The internal pressure to rush diminishes because the person now understands that growth is cumulative. This perspective fosters patience, not the passive kind, but a strategic patience rooted in awareness of timing and sequence. Such patience is associated with improved cognitive performance and reduced stress, as the individual is no longer caught in cycles of urgency or fear of missing out. Interpersonal interactions also evolve during this phase. With greater self-awareness and stability, individuals engage in relationships with clearer intentions and healthier boundaries. Dialogue becomes more honest, and misunderstandings decrease because communication is rooted in clarity rather than emotional reactivity. Individuals are better able to articulate needs, express limitations, and offer support without overextending themselves. As a result, relational dynamics grow more anchored, collaborative, and mutually beneficial. Simultaneously, individuals develop a sharper awareness of their social and environmental influences. They become more discerning about the information they consume, the people they surround themselves with, and the environments they frequent. This discernment emerges from an understanding that external inputs shape internal states. Many individuals begin to intentionally curate their environments, reducing exposure to noise, distraction, or negativity, while prioritizing spaces that support cognitive clarity and emotional balance. Behavioral science supports this notion, showing that environmental design plays a critical role in shaping behavior and reinforcing habit formation. In parallel with these developments, the individual encounters a deeper form of self-observation. This is not the hypercritical scrutiny typical of earlier phases, but a calm, objective awareness of one's own patterns. Such metacognition allows individuals to adjust behaviors before they escalate into problems. This quiet vigilance reflects an advanced level of cognitive maturity. It mirrors what contemplative sciences describe as non-judgmental awareness, an internal posture that enables adaptation without self-condemnation. By this stage, individuals begin to experience a more stable sense of internal coherence. Thought, emotion, and action operate in greater unison, reducing internal conflict and enhancing decision-making accuracy. This coherence becomes a foundation for more advanced forms of growth, setting the stage for capacities such as purpose-driven innovation, high-level problem-solving, and greater social or professional influence. The person is no longer reacting to life, but consciously shaping it from a place of steadiness and clarity. Chosen one, as this sacred message comes to a close, take a breath and recognize the truth rising within you. Your victory is not pending, it is sealed. Your breakthrough is not approaching, it is already here. You are standing in your Kairos moment, the divinely appointed hour where heaven's timing meets your obedience, your faith, and your readiness to receive. Chosen one, the supernatural transfer has begun. What God has spoken over you is already unfolding in the unseen. Doors are aligning, provision is moving, angels are positioned. What once felt delayed is now being delivered. Nothing in this world can stop what heaven has already set in motion. Walk forward with reverence and boldness. Rest, but do not retreat. Receive, but do not doubt. This is your season of divine ease, divine clarity, and divine abundance. Your spirit is being strengthened, your path is being cleared, your name is being carried into rooms you have never entered, guided by the hand of the Almighty. Chosen one, lift your head. Your future is secure, your blessings are assigned, your steps are ordered. Remain faithful, stay aligned. Keep your heart soft and your worship pure. What is coming next will confirm everything God whispered in the quiet. If this word stirred your spirit, you may write 888 in the comments as a symbol of overflowing abundance. And if this message blessed you, you are welcome to join this community of anointed ones, walking in purpose and promise. Go in peace, chosen one. Go in confidence. Go in the fullness of what God has already released. Your victory is sealed. Rest and receive.